This happened about 10 years ago, during the holiday season. My family and I were driving from Ohio to Wyoming to visit relatives. There'd been some nasty storms farther north, so instead of heading northwest right away, we drove straight west and spent the night in Omaha. The next day, we pushed north through Nebraska and into South Dakota. After a few hours, we turned west onto I-90. At that point, it had been well over an hour since we'd seen anything resembling a public restroom. And as anyone who's traveled with a young child knows, that kind of stretch is a ticking time bomb. Our daughter, who was 5 at the time, had been squirming for miles, and to be honest, I needed to go just as badly. South Dakota was even emptier than Nebraska, just endless horizon and the occasional billboard. Finally, like a little miracle, a rest stop appeared on the side of the highway. We pulled in immediately. But just as we did, a brown and cream pickup that had been behind us for some time also pulled in, parking a few spaces over. At first, I didn't think much of it. Highway travelers tend to cluster together at rest stops. But when I turned to open my door, I caught a glimpse of the driver. He gave me a chill I couldn't explain. He was thin, pale, with a scraggly gray-brown beard and sunken eyes. He wore a stained blue plaid shirt and had this vacant, glassy look in his eyes that just didn't sit right. He got out of the truck and started rummaging around in the bed, not grabbing anything, just moving things around. I turned to my husband, Alaric, and whispered, "I don't want to go in there alone. Something's off about that guy." Alaric gave me a skeptical look but nodded. "All right, let's go together." By that point, the next known town was Wall, still 100 miles off, according to the billboards we'd been passing. Alaric figured he might as well use the facilities too, even though he didn't really need to. So we all headed in, me, Alaric, and our daughter, Selah. I glanced back just as we reached the entrance. The man was following us. He wasn't carrying anything, just trailing behind, slowly, hands in his pockets. Selah and I ducked into the women's restroom. I made it quick. She did too. When we came back out into the small lobby, Alaric was already there, waiting. But so was the man. He stood near the wall, just staring. His eyes were fixed on Alaric. Not moving. Not blinking. Alaric glanced at me, and without saying a word, took Selah's hand and hurried us back to the car. The second we were in, he locked the doors. Then he told me the guy never even went into the restroom. He just stood there the whole time, watching. "Whatever that was," Alaric said, "I'm glad you said something. I don't like the way he looked at us." We pulled out and got back on the road. The 100-mile stretch to Wall was uneventful, quiet and vast, with only a few scattered turnoffs. We didn't see the truck following us and figured the man had gone his own way. We even started to relax a little. When we got to Wall, we stopped for lunch and to check out the quirky little tourist shops we'd seen advertised for miles. It was the kind of place that tried hard to be charming, overpriced snacks, knickknacks, and stuffed jackalopes on every shelf. We were browsing inside one of the stores, just killing time, when I felt that same chill run down my spine. I turned. He was there, not 20 feet away. Same trucker cap, same ratty beard, same filthy plaid shirt. He stood between two shelves, staring at us. My stomach dropped. We hadn't seen his truck. We'd assumed he hadn't followed us. But somehow he was there again, and closer than ever. We didn't wait. We grabbed our snacks, paid quickly, and left the store. We didn't even look around to see if he followed. We just got in the car and drove. Fast. We never saw him again after that. We made it to Wyoming without incident. But I didn't sleep well that night, or for several nights after. This happened several years ago. I was 11 at the time, riding in the back seat with my family, my parents and older brother, as we drove through the desolate stretches of Montana. It was the dead of winter and the middle of the night. We used to own a little place far out in the backcountry, a remote cabin we'd retreat to every so often for a week of fishing, hiking, and disconnecting. That night, we were heading back towards civilization after one of those trips. The road cut through mountain passes, flanked by towering walls of dirty snow. Beyond those snowbanks stood dark forests, their trees pressed together so tightly they seemed to form a wall against the night. We hadn't seen another car for hours. The only sound was the crunch of tires over the icy road and the faint hum of the heater trying to fight off the cold. I had half my forehead leaned against the cold window glass, letting the chill numb my thoughts as I stared out into the darkness, watching patches of snow and the occasional break in the trees slide past in the headlights. That's when I saw her. She stood just off the side of the road, alone and completely still. To this day, I remember her as a woman. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what my mind has always settled on. She wore a tattered coat layered over several hooded sweaters, and she clutched 2 large, stuffed bags in her gloved hands. Her hair was matted, and her cheeks were hollow, but what stood out most was her face, pale under the moonlight with a faint, eerie glow. Not quite lifeless, but not entirely present either. I wasn't the only one who saw her. "See that?" my dad muttered, his voice flat. "Must be freezing out there." My mom turned her head. "Should we stop? We could give them a ride." But by the time the words left her mouth, we were already halfway up the pass, the woman swallowed by the darkness behind us. The idea of turning around was mentioned, but no one pressed it. The cold had a way of making everything feel distant, even decisions. We crested the mountain, and I felt the pressure shift in my ears. The descent on the other side began. The road was winding, narrow, and slick, but the old family SUV handled it well. I kept my eyes on the window, watching for any lights in the distance, some sign of a town, a house, anything. But there was nothing. Just snow, trees, silence. We started winding down the switchbacks, the trees pressing in again, and that's when I saw her. Again. She stood on the opposite side of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. But this time, the headlights caught her face for a moment, just long enough for me to see it clearly. And I wish I hadn't. Her smile was wrong. Wide. Crooked. Too many teeth showing. Her face was disfigured, warped as though it had melted and been reshaped by cruel hands. One eye was larger than the other, and both were coal-black, like polished stones. In that brief second, as we passed, she locked eyes with me. Her smile deepened, like she knew something I didn't. Like there was a secret between us. I didn't say anything. I just stared out the window, my breath fogging the glass. Then it hit me. How did she get there? We had climbed for miles before we first saw her. There were no turnoffs, no driveways, no other roads. We had passed nothing but forest and snow. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of us on foot. And we hadn't passed a single vehicle. Not one. She had been behind us. And then she was ahead of us. The unease I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion, dread, the slow realization that something wasn't right. Eventually, we made it down the mountain into flatter terrain and pulled into a small roadside motel. It was one of those old places with flickering porch lights and faded doors, and we were just happy to have a bed for the night. We checked in, unloaded quickly, and fell into exhausted silence. The next morning, we drove a few miles into the nearby town and stopped at a weathered little diner for breakfast. The kind of place that's equal parts truck stop and time capsule. Inside, we found a booth, ordered pancakes and eggs, and started playing I Spy to pass the time while we waited for the food. After we paid, we started zipping up coats and heading for the door. The bell above it jingled as someone entered. I turned almost casually and then froze. It was her. Same coat, same bags, same layers of hooded sweaters. She looked damp, like she'd been walking all night through snow and slush. Her face still wore that awful, twisted smile, and her hair hung in wet clumps over her eyes. She passed close to me, too close, and for a second, she turned her head, locking eyes with me like she had on the road. And she looked angry. Not the kind of anger you see in someone who's been wronged. It was deeper than that. She looked like she hated me, like she knew me, like I had done something unforgivable, and she was just waiting for the right moment to make me remember what it was. She stopped beside me, just for a beat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. But I stayed behind my dad, kept moving, and didn't look back. We got into the car and drove away. I don't know what her story was. Maybe she was just someone down on her luck, wandering the frozen roads of Montana with everything she owned on her back. Maybe she'd been hurt and was too afraid to ask for help. Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for how she got ahead of us. I've stayed in a lot of motels over the years, from dusty roadside dives to quiet, clean places tucked away off old highways. Some are charming, others barely functioning. But there's one I found by accident, off a lonely stretch of Route 84, that I'll never forget. Not because it was dirty or noisy or overpriced, but because something happened there that still keeps me awake at night. Something I can't explain. It was late fall, and I'd been driving for hours. The sun had long since disappeared behind a wall of clouds, and the road ahead felt endless. I was trying to make it to the next town before midnight, but the darkness was thick, and the empty fields stretched on forever. My headlights barely cut through the mist, and the only signs of civilization were the occasional rusted fence or collapsed barn. When I saw the flickering neon sign in the distance, I felt a strange kind of relief. The sign read simply, vacancy. The letters buzzed and sputtered, casting a sickly green glow over the gravel parking lot. The building was a single-story structure, maybe 10 rooms total, all facing the lot. A few old cars sat in front of rooms with their curtains drawn tight. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Faded paint, cracked pavement, weeds growing up through the concrete. But I was too tired to care. I just needed a bed for the night. I pulled in and parked near the office. The air was colder than expected, and a thin mist clung to the ground, curling around my boots as I stepped out. The only light came from the neon sign behind me and a single dull bulb above the front door. The lobby was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of mildew. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and a dusty clock on the wall ticked a second too slow. Behind the counter sat an old man with a waxy complexion and thick, smudged glasses. He didn't look up when I walked in, just stared down at something behind the counter. "I need a room," I said. He moved slowly, his joints creaking like old wood. He reached under the desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its corners frayed and stained with something dark. Without a word, he slid it across the counter and handed me a pen. "Room 6, he mumbled after I scribbled my name. "No smoking. No pets." He didn't ask for ID. Didn't even glance at my signature. Just turned around, took a key from a rusted hook, and slid it toward me. His fingers were thin and gray like dried roots. I took the key and left without another word. Room 6 was at the far end of the building, right next to a line of skeletal trees that bordered the property. The door was warped and chipped, the number barely readable. The key turned with a reluctant click, and I stepped inside. It was worse than I expected. The room was small and stale, with a sagging bed, a rickety dresser, and a television that looked like it hadn't worked since Reagan was in office. The carpet was stained a dozen different shades of brown, and the wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten. Still, it was warm, and I was too exhausted to care. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down. The mattress groaned under my weight. I turned on the TV, but all I got was static, white noise hissing into the room like distant whispers. I shut it off and stared at the walls, trying to ignore the creeping sense of wrongness that seemed to cling to everything. There was a small door to the side, leading to the bathroom. I stepped in and found a cracked mirror, a flickering light, and a sink that dripped in slow, rhythmic beats. After washing up, I changed into sweats and crawled into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to my shoulders. The room was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that pushes on your ears, makes your thoughts feel louder than they should be. I turned off the lamp and lay there, eyes open, staring into the dark. Somewhere outside, something tapped on the door. It was soft, delicate. Tap. Pause. Tap. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was too steady, too intentional. For a moment, I thought it might be another guest, maybe someone drunk, knocking on the wrong door. But the sound didn't move. It didn't fumble or drift. It stayed exactly where it was, just a few feet from where I lay. I sat up slowly, heart thudding in my chest. The room felt colder than before. I reached for the lamp, but hesitated. The tapping stopped. I waited. Then it came again, this time from the window. Tap. 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 The window was just beside the bed, covered by a thin curtain that barely blocked out the green glow from the neon sign. The sound was faint, like fingernails brushing the glass. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in me screamed to stay where I was, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't ignore it. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, turned it on, and slid out of bed. My bare feet hit the cold carpet. I crossed to the window slowly, each step agonizing. The tapping stopped as I reached the curtain. I held my breath. Then I yanked the curtain aside and shone the light into the night. Nothing. Just the parking lot. Empty. Silent. The mist curling along the ground like smoke. But then I saw it. A footprint. Just one, pressed into the gravel outside the window. Large. Deep. Leading away into the trees. I backed away from the window, my skin crawling. I locked the door. Checked the bathroom. Pushed the dresser in front of the door, just in case. I sat back in bed, flashlight still in hand, and waited for morning. But the night wasn't done. At some point, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Not from the door. Not from the window. From inside the room. A soft creak. The sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. I sat up, flashlight beam darting across the walls. The room was empty. But the sound came again, closer this time. like someone was moving slowly, deliberately, just behind me. I turned, shining the light toward the bathroom. The door was open. It had been closed when I went to bed. I stepped toward it, every part of me screaming to stop. I pushed the door wider and aimed the light inside. Nothing, but written on the mirror in foggy letters were 3 words: "Stay the night." I didn't. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and bolted. I didn't bother returning the room key. Didn't stop to check out. I just drove, faster than I ever have, until the morning sun finally broke over the horizon. I don't know what was in that room. I don't know who or what left that message. But I do know this: I wasn't alone in room 6, and I never will be again. There's something about being out on the water that's both peaceful and deeply unsettling. The silence, the reflection, the way the lake stretches out into darkness, offering nowhere to hide. I've always loved fishing, especially on remote waters where it feels like the rest of the world disappears. But after what happened on that lake a few summers ago, I'm not sure I'll ever feel comfortable out there again. It was late August, the tail end of summer, when my friend Everin and I decided to take a trip to a lake we'd heard about from a couple of locals in a dusty roadside diner. It wasn't on any official map, just a place whispered about: clear water, great fishing, and more importantly, solitude. A place where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. The road there was barely a road, just a winding, overgrown trail that twisted through the woods like a snake. The trees leaned in close, the branches clawing at the windows as we passed. By the time we arrived, the sun was sinking behind the treetops, casting an amber glow over the water. The lake was beautiful, no doubt, silver and smooth like a mirror. But there was a stillness to it that felt wrong, like the world had paused. We set up camp on a small patch of dirt by the shore, our tent facing the water. There was a chill to the air, a reminder that summer was dying. The stars were already beginning to show, and the forest around us was deathly quiet. No insects, no birds, just the faint lapping of water. We decided to fish a bit before it got too dark, pushing our little aluminum boat out into the lake. The oars dipped into the water with soft splashes, the only sound in the void. It was peaceful, but not in a comforting way. More like the silence before something breaks. We floated to the center of the lake, the lantern glowing faintly. We cast our lines and waited. That's when I saw him. A figure on the far shore, thin, unmoving. At first, I thought it was a tree or a trick of the light. But no, it was a man, just standing there, watching. "Everin," I said, barely above a whisper. "You see that?" He turned, squinting toward where I was pointing. "Yeah, weird. Think he's another camper?" "I don't think so," I replied. "I thought we were the only ones out here." Everin shrugged, trying to play it off. "Maybe a hiker. Locals, maybe." We tried to focus on our lines, but every time I glanced back, the man was still there. He didn't move, didn't sit, didn't even shift his weight. Just stood and stared, no gear, no light, no expression. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. "I want to leave," I said quietly. Everin didn't argue. We reeled in our lines, and I started rowing back. I kept my eyes on the shoreline, but the man never moved. Not an inch. We pulled the boat onto the sand and turned toward our tent. I glanced back, still there. The man hadn't followed, but he was still watching. The fire we'd built earlier had died down to embers, casting a low red light across the clearing. We didn't speak, just sat and listened to the stillness. I couldn't get the man's face out of my head. He hadn't done anything, but the way he stood there, empty, detached, it was wrong. Everin broke the silence. "Maybe we should have talked to him," he said, not sounding convinced. "Maybe he's just weird." "Yeah," I muttered. "Or maybe not." We cooked a quick dinner, trying to keep our minds occupied, but the air felt heavier by the minute. My ears strained for any sound, any sign we weren't alone. Eventually, we turned in, crawling into the tent. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, every nerve taut. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. The lake lapped at the shore, and then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the side of the tent. I went stiff. It was too deliberate, too slow to be the wind. Tap, tap, tap. I reached over and shook Everin. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" The tapping came again, louder. Right by our heads. Everin grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent a few inches, just enough to peek out. Nothing. But as he swept the beam across the ground, the light caught something, footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the lake straight to our tent. And then back. Someone had been watching us. From the water's edge. And then crept up while we were sleeping, We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We packed as fast as we could, grabbing only what we could carry. The shoreline was empty, the man gone. We sped down the forest road, the trees flashing by like ghosts. Every now and then, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a figure running behind us. But there was only blackness. Back on the highway, the lights of the town finally came into view. We found a cheap motel and locked the door tight. Neither of us slept. We never spoke about it again. But I still remember that face, blank, unmoving. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he was there. But I know what I saw. And I know we weren't alone. I've been a land surveyor for nearly 20 years. I've traversed some of the most remote corners of the American Southwest. Miles of harsh terrain, scorched earth, and silence so deep it presses down on your chest. I've encountered wild animals, blistering heat, and breakdowns in places that don't even have names. But nothing prepared me for what I found beneath that bridge in the Arizona desert. It still claws at the back of my mind, still visits me in those restless hours just before dawn. Because once you've seen something like that, once you've come face to face with something that should not exist, you never walk away the same. It was mid-July, and the heat was the kind that doesn't just burn your skin, it cooks you from within. The air shimmered above the sand, and everything, rocks, metal, even the sky, seemed to radiate heat. My assignment was simple: inspect an old bridge that spanned a dry arroyo roughly 50 miles southeast of Phoenix. It was part of a forgotten highway bypass, probably built back in the 60s and barely used since. They assigned the job to me because I prefer working solo. Always have. There's a strange peace in being alone, surrounded by nothing but sun-bleached silence. No one to interrupt, no one to slow you down. I packed light, as I always do. Gear in the back of my truck, a full tank of water, and a revolver holstered at my hip. A habit I picked up after one too many rattlesnake encounters. The drive out there took nearly 3 hours. The road degraded the further I went, the pavement breaking apart until it was little more than a path of dirt and gravel. Cacti stood like sentinels on either side, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at for too long. There were no homes, no cars, not even telephone poles, just the sound of my tires crunching over the dry earth. I reached the bridge around midday. It loomed ahead like a skeleton of rusted steel and crumbling concrete. It wasn't large, probably no more than 80 feet across, but it cast a long shadow over the arroyo beneath. I parked my truck on the side of the road and stepped out, the heat hitting me like a furnace blast. There was no wind, no birds, just the low hum of cicadas and the crackle of heat rising off the sand. I began my inspection, checking the supports and noting the corrosion. The decay was worse than I expected. Rust bloomed across the beams like rot, and one of the concrete abutments had cracked wide enough for me to fit my hand inside. I climbed down into the arroyo, boots slipping slightly on the slope of dry gravel, and made my way beneath the bridge where the light barely reached. That's when I saw it. Tucked into the shadows beneath the span was an old, battered dumpster, completely out of place in a place like this. It wasn't just rusted, it looked like it had been forgotten decades ago. The paint was peeling, the metal warped and dented. Graffiti covered almost every inch, symbols I didn't recognize, words scrawled in languages I couldn't place. The desert has a way of swallowing things, but even so, this felt wrong. Like it didn't belong to the natural decay of time, but to something else. Something recent. The smell hit me before I even reached it, a sour, rotting stench that made me gag. I hesitated. I should have turned around, should have finished my report, and left. But curiosity has always been my weakness. I stepped closer, covering my nose with my shirt, and cautiously lifted the lid. Inside was a nest. That's the only way I can describe it. A sick, chaotic mess of old blankets, torn clothing, and food containers picked clean. Someone had been living here, surviving here. But there was more. Carved into the inside walls of the dumpster were figures, etched with something sharp. Dozens of them. Twisted, contorted faces. Some with empty holes for eyes. Others with mouths stretched impossibly wide. Interspersed between the faces were symbols I didn't recognize, circles, spirals, jagged lines that seemed to vibrate when I looked at them too long. My skin prickled. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. I was no stranger to transient camps. I'd stumbled across a few in city outskirts, sometimes even deep in the woods. But this didn't feel the same. There was no sense of shelter, no order, just madness, desperation, like whoever had lived here had long since stopped being human. I turned back to the bridge, eager to finish the job and leave. But then I heard it. The crunch of gravel. Footsteps. My blood froze. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I spun around, adrenaline dumping into my veins. There was no one on the road. No one beneath the bridge. But the sound continued, echoing softly through the arroyo. I scanned the shadows, heart pounding, and that's when I saw him. He stepped out from behind the dumpster like he'd always been there. Tall, gaunt, filthy. His skin was streaked with dirt and dried blood. His hair was matted and hung in greasy clumps around his face. His clothes, if they could still be called that, were little more than rags. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were wide, too wide, and they didn't blink. He stared at me, unblinking, unmoving. Just watching. I raised my hands instinctively. Hey, I didn't mean to trespass. I'm just here to inspect the bridge. He didn't move. Didn't respond. I took a step back. Look, I'll go. You don't have to. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It didn't reach his eyes. It stretched too far across his face, showing yellow, crooked teeth. And then he spoke. This is my place, he said, voice dry and cracked, like wind scraping across bone. You don't belong here. I tried to keep my voice calm. I get it. I'll leave now. But he took a step forward, then another. I reached for the revolver at my side and pulled it free, pointing it straight at him. Stop. Right there. He didn't. You think that'll help? He whispered, taking another step. Out here, no one hears you scream. Out here, you're already mine. I fired a warning shot into the dirt. The boom echoed like a cannon blast. He flinched, but only slightly. Then his smile widened. I didn't wait for him to make a move. I turned and bolted, boots scrambling for purchase on the gravel as I made a beeline for my truck. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster now, crunching closer. I reached the door, yanked it open, and climbed in, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw it in reverse, tires spitting dust into the air, then spun the wheel and tore out of there, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, 20 miles later. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him clinging to the back of the truck. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning. Told him I'd been followed. Threatened. He didn't ask many questions. Just reassigned the job to someone else. I didn't ask who. I didn't want to know. But the nightmares came anyway. In them, I'm back under the bridge. The sun is gone. The air is cold. And I can hear him breathing just behind me. Sometimes he speaks. Sometimes he doesn't. But he's always there. Watching. Waiting. A few weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched for any reports about that bridge. Accidents. Missing persons. Anything. I found a news article from 15 years earlier. A drifter had been found dead beneath that very same bridge. No identification. No known cause of death. Just a dried-up corpse, mouth wide open like he'd died screaming. Over the years, my friends and I explored countless trails and camped in some pretty remote places. But there's one trip none of us will ever forget. A weekend in a cabin buried deep in the woods that we found through an obscure online listing. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from the chaos of daily life, a chance to unplug and breathe in the quiet. Instead, it turned into something else entirely, a memory that still makes my skin crawl. The plan was simple: drive out to this ancient cabin that we'd rented for next to nothing, spend the weekend hiking, cooking over a fire, and maybe telling a few ghost stories. The listing had described the place as rustic and isolated. Exactly what we wanted. Just us and the trees. We left early Friday morning, the 5 of us crammed into Thorne's battered SUV, laughing as we passed through sleepy towns and into the dense thickets of forest. The road narrowed into twisted gravel paths, the trees forming a tunnel overhead. Soon there were no power lines, no mailboxes, just shadows and branches. The GPS flickered and died as we drove deeper into nowhere. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had begun to dip, casting long, claw-like shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked ancient, its paint blistered and flaking, the porch sagging like it had lost the will to stand. Its windows stared back at us, black and empty. It had the look of something abandoned, something forgotten. I felt the chill before I stepped out of the car, and it wasn't from the air. "Looks cozy," Thorne joked, though his voice betrayed him. We laughed, but it was uneasy, brittle. No one wanted to admit it, but something felt wrong. Inside, the cabin was worse. Dust coated everything. The furniture groaned when touched. The kitchen was a museum of outdated appliances, and the living room was a circle of collapsing chairs around a soot-stained fireplace. A narrow staircase led to a dim loft with 2 tiny bedrooms. As we unpacked, I had the strangest sensation that we weren't alone. Not in the ghostly sense, but like we were trespassing somewhere alive. That night, Thorne and I lit a fire while the others made a simple dinner, hot dogs and beans. We sat around the flames, trying to shake the unease. The wind howled outside like it was circling something. After dinner, we ventured a little into the woods, just to explore before dark. The forest was choked with undergrowth. The trees blocked the light, casting everything in a dull gray. The further we walked, the more suffocating it became. Then we found the clearing. A cluster of old gravestones huddled together like forgotten teeth jutting from the soil. No names, just worn rocks and silence. There were no paths, no ruins, just graves in the middle of nothing. "Guess we know why the rent was so cheap," said Calla, her laugh too sharp, too high. I smiled, but it felt wrong. We left fast. The dark was closing in. Back at the cabin, we tried to shake it off with card games and ghost stories, but the vibe had shifted. The fire cast weird shadows, and every creak in the floor made us jump. At one point, it started, a soft crunching sound outside. Like slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. We froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Lorne nodded, pale. "Probably an animal," he said, though none of us believed it. The sound was too careful. It paused, resumed, circled. "I'm going out there," I said, grabbing a flashlight. Thorne followed. The others stayed frozen by the fire. We opened the door slowly. The air outside was colder than it should have been. I swept the light across the porch and into the woods. Nothing. The sound had stopped, but the silence was worse. We crept around the cabin. Still nothing. No prints. No movement. Just the dark. Back inside, we tried to pretend everything was fine. We decided to sleep in the living room together. No one dared to use the bedrooms. We laid out our sleeping bags around the fireplace. I listened to every sound, the wind, the wood shifting, the barely there creaks. And just when I started to doze off, it returned. Footsteps. Upstairs. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth above us. We stared at the ceiling, too scared to move. "Someone's up there," Thorne whispered. The steps moved to the top of the stairs. Then silence. Then, they started descending. I don't know what took hold of me, but I leapt up, grabbed the flashlight, and hissed, "We're leaving." Now. Everyone scrambled. We didn't pack. We didn't look back. We tore out of the cabin and into the frozen dark. Thorne dropped the keys, fumbled, cursed. Then the doors unlocked and we piled in. We drove. We didn't stop until the forest was far behind us. Thorne finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, still shaking. "But I'm never going back." We found a motel that night, huddled together like kids. None of us spoke much. There were no answers. Just the sound of those footsteps descending the stairs, still echoing in my head.